Well, good morning.
Good morning.
If you would, please open up to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1. I really like the book of Exodus. It's been a while since I've done a study in the book, and so these past few weeks preparing for this has been a really good refresher. And I hope that it'll be helpful for all of you because just like in Genesis, there is a ton in the book of Exodus that is all building up to Jesus. And it is especially emphasized in Exodus chapter 1. We're going to be seeing one of those promises be really pushed to completion. And so I have a map here of the area that we're going to be covering in the book of Exodus. When we talk about Goshen, that's right here in between these rivers. It was a rich and fertile land filled with greenery, and it was perfect for shepherding. So that's right here in what would be considered Lower Egypt. Going to be seeing later, this is the Sinai wilderness, and Mount Sinai is most likely right here, which we'll show later on, just so that we have kind of an idea of where we are. And then this is where Moses will be in his time in Midian towards the north. So that's basically that area right here until until Numbers. This is where we're going to be because we're not actually going to enter into the land of Canaan, as you may already know. So the date of Exodus is typically given as 1446 or 1447 BC. And the reason for that is found in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1. Would somebody turn there for me? 1 Kings chapter 6. 1 Kings 6 verse 1.
And it came to pass in the 418th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, that he began to build the house of the Lord.
Thank you. Did you say 418?
480. 480.
Okay, I'm just making sure there wasn't a variant that I didn't know. So the 480th year in the fourth year of Solomon's reign. Now it's pretty indisputable that Solomon reigned from 970 to 931 or 930 BC. And so in the fourth year, that would be 966. And so 480 years before that brings us to our number of 1446 or 1447. And that's important because there are a lot of historical things that we don't have when it comes to this time period. For the Egyptian Empire, for the Israelites, for many empires, there's just this gap in history almost where nobody really has a lot of information on really most of the countries in this area. It's really weird. It's almost like it was just wiped away. But that's the closest estimation. Some will say a different day. We're going to go with 1446 for right now. But anyways, Exodus, the name itself is from the Greek translation of the text, and it simply is just translated the departure or a going out. And the Hebrew or the original title of the book was just names because it starts in chapter 1 with the names of the people who exited or who were in Egypt originally. And the last thing we'll really talk about concerning the book as a whole is the authorship. It's most commonly attributed to Moses, and the Bible attributes it to Moses being the one who wrote the book. If we want to go over to Exodus chapter 17 and verse 4, and Julie, would you read that? Exodus 17, verse 4. Sorry, 17:14.
Said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven.
So over and over in the book of Exodus, God tells Moses to write these things down. And when it comes to writing down the law, God tells Moses to write down the law, which is the book of Leviticus. And so even Jesus himself in Luke chapter 24, verse 44, calls the first five books the law of Moses. So there are different people that argue differently, but we're just going with what the text says. Moses wrote these books. All right, now let's get into Exodus chapter 1. So first, we're given a summary of who is in Egypt in the first 7 verses. And that's because chapters 1 through 4.
I just want to pass this along. We were watching on TV, on TV about Exodus, and one of the things that was the discrepancy was the time period that they crossed over in there, and they were debating whether it was 1400 or 1200 BC.
Yeah,
And so it's interesting that you brought this up about Solomon here, and that I'm glad you did.
yeah.
Okay.
Typically, any position that is debated, I'm gonna just stick with the biblical position.
What's interesting about it, that's the only thing with the time period that was disputed. Anything else?
Yeah, yeah, that is true. It really is the only thing disputed in this. Anything else on the introduction? All right. Well, the first 4 chapters in general are primarily here to set up what happens in the rest of the book. We start with the very foundation of who was in Egypt. And who was that in these first 7 verses? We saw it in the end of Genesis as well. Yeah, the children of Israel, Jacob's children and their family, and it gives us a total of 70 people who moved to Egypt. And then, of course, it excludes Joseph and his family because he's already there. So there's a little over 70 people that moved to Egypt by the time we end in Genesis chapter 50. And so where we left off in Genesis, there were hundreds of years that have passed since God promises to Abraham. And yet, have any of the 3 major promises been fulfilled? What are those promises?
Give you a great land, make you a great nation. Through your seed, all nations will be blessed.
Right. And there are only 70 people. That doesn't sound like a nation that's as many as the dust of the earth. They have no land. They are living under the Pharaoh's allowance in the land of Goshen in Egypt. And of course, nothing has come from them that would have blessed all the earth. But God fulfilled other promises during the time of Genesis. He gave Abraham. Yeah. What's that?
People, it's a great thing that have a line of.
So that's gonna happen, but that wasn't fulfilled in Genesis,
One thing.
right? But they lost all their land when they went to Goshen. So what promises have been fulfilled?
Well, they are increasing in number.
It's true. But there are 3 promises in particular that God fulfilled for each generation. And that was first that he would bless them greatly. They all became very wealthy when they eventually started following God. But also that he would bless those who were associated with them positively and curse those who were associated with them negatively. How many times did he do that? And he did that in order to make sure that his people were taken care of by those who were associated good or bad. God took care of that. And then also, every time that God made a promise about giving them a child or which child would be next in line for something, God made sure, no matter how unlikely it seemed, that that promise would happen. And so, although he hasn't fulfilled any of these major promises, he has been giving them over and over enough evidence to understand that he will do that, even if it's not during a time that they see. And Joseph, at the end of his life, even goes to the people who are in Egypt and reassures them there will be a day where God visits you and God takes you out of this land. And remember, you may not remember, and that's fine, but whenever it says that God visits someone in the Old and New Testament, it's not that he goes and hangs out with them. Visiting is the idea of going there to fix something or to help them. And so when they say that God will come and visit you, God's going to fix your situation. So he has to reassure them because Joseph knew that was true because of what all he lived through with God. But anyways, in chapter 1, God is going to show us now how even though all of Genesis, none of those 3 great promises were fulfilled, he's actually been working behind the scenes to fulfill them. We already saw that a little bit in how he brought the people into the land of Egypt through Joseph, but now he is going to fulfill this great nation promise while they're in the land of Egypt. Uh, would you read verse 7 of Exodus chapter 1?
But the children of Israel will grow fruitful and increase abundantly, multiply and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with.
So while they're in Egypt, they're given a place where they can safely herd their flocks in a rich green land in a way that they're really not going to be disturbed by the Egyptians, because the Egyptians, as we've already discussed, really despise the work of shepherding. So they're not going to go be messing around with the shepherds. And also, we saw that they despised Hebrews in general. And so, although Joseph made that a little bit better in his time while he was alive, this is generations down. We see in the text that this is a time where a new Pharaoh came, verse 8, who did not know Joseph. And this doesn't mean that they had never heard of Joseph. I think that we can all understand that, but that it was far enough down the line that he was just a distant story to them. He was someone in their history who has done great things. It's kind of like if we're not careful when we hear about great things from people like our presidents, maybe George Washington, it can start to sound like just a story in the past if we're not careful to make sure it doesn't sound like that in our head. It's the same situation here. Joseph is generations behind, further than George Washington would have been from us. And so they just think of him as a distant name. They don't really remember everything about him. And also, this Pharaoh, well, we're actually going to go through a few different Pharaohs from the one in verse Joseph, because in verse 9, he talks about how there are too many Hebrews now, which would have taken many generations to bring about. And then verses 10 through 11, because of how many Hebrews there were, they started to fear them. And so what did they do? Yeah, they dealt very harshly with them, specifically in verse 11. And then who would you read verse 12 for me?
But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in the dread of the children of Israel.
I really love chapter 1 because God starts off very quickly, at least in the text, of this is now the time for this great nation promise to happen. Verse 7, they multiplied greatly, so much that the Egyptians started to fear them. Then verse 12, when they tried to oppress them to make it happen less, then they grew more, which is something that is actually pretty common in history. How often do you hear about time periods where people were really poor and overworked, but they had more children? Like you have no money, you have no idea how they afforded it, but they'd have 12 kids. It's pretty common in history for that kind of thing to happen. And so it's almost like they were perfectly set up to get into a situation where they would have more kids because their whole life would be about family at this point because their work is bad. They're slaves now, so that they're certainly not getting paid enough for what they're doing. So what do they have left? Family. And they multiply exceedingly. And so because of that multiplication, they were made to work harder. And because they were made to work harder, they had more children. And so it was a situation where it was perfect for growth, although the people were suffering. And then in verses 15 through 22, Pharaoh has had enough of all of this growth. And so what does he instruct the midwives to do in verse 16? Yeah, kill all the male children that you find that are delivered. But thankfully, according to verse 17, the midwives feared God. So what did they do?
Didn't do that.
Yeah, they didn't do anything. They let the children be born, and then they went back to Pharaoh and said, nothing we can do about it. They were already born by the time we got there. And then they continue to grow once more. We're given another section of that. And it says in verse 20 that because the midwives were so helpful, that God deals very well with them. And again in verse 20, it ends with, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. So do you get the emphasis? What's God allowing to happen?
their growth in the face of the adversity.
Exactly. He's finishing that first promise through adversity. And then finally, Pharaoh has had enough. And at the end of the chapter, he tells everyone, this is a public command now, not just to the midwives, to make sure that the male children are killed, verse 22. And this time it works. How do we know? Well, brings us right into chapter 2. What is a mother having to do? Hide her male child and put him in a river. So this is now a common thing in the nation of Israel. People are scared, people are hiding, and that brings us literally right into chapter 2, because when Moses is born, which is who this next few chapters are about, the mother of Moses is having to hide out of fear that they'll take and kill her son. And so after chapter 1 establishes the situation that they're in, these next few chapters, 2, 3, and 4, are all going to be about Moses, because God is going to take Moses and raise him into a leader that will bring the people out of Egypt. Now, is Moses a part of the lineage of Christ? No. Moses is actually a Levite, brother of Aaron the Levite. And we know that Christ is going to come through which tribe? Judah. And so, why are we focusing on Moses when the entire Old Testament is about the lineage and bringing of the Christ? Well, it's because without Moses and without God, or at least raising some sort of leader, there would be no more lineage, because the original, man, my English just gone. Eventually, the nation would disintegrate without male children. But just like when God kind of went away from the lineage to look at Joseph, and Joseph ended up being the one to preserve the lineage through God's work, it's the same thing here. God's going to Moses for a little bit, because Moses is going to be the one to preserve that lineage. And so it's very important. And so Moses was born to two Levites. That's in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. And his mother, wanting to avoid being caught, does what? Yeah, she hides him for as long as she can, which, does anyone remember how long? 3 months. Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add to what you were saying before, was that also I think God was sowing the seeds of the Levitical priesthood here, because Moses' older brother, Aaron, was in the beginning of those.
Yeah. And right now, things don't exactly look good for the Levitical lineage, because the last thing we've heard about them was what happened in Shechem and the curses that were brought upon them because of that.
I can kind of understand Pharaoh here and people of Egypt uh, concerned about what's going on here, that they were afraid of these people growing in number and being supplied with everything they need from God. Because even in our day and time, I can't help but wonder if some of the things that's happening, that I wonder, God, what's going on here? Because God's really saying everything seems to be going a certain way. Why?
Yeah.
I understand that.
And there is a little bit um of confusion there, just from the fact that the Hebrews were peaceful, and they had so far done nothing but good for the Egyptians. But from a physical standpoint of looking at these people who really only benefit from you, you can imagine, well, they could also benefit from just taking what we have if we if they were bigger than us. So yeah, I get what you're saying. You can see it from both ends. Um, but then we continue. Well, is there anything else before we continue? All right, so she hides him for about 3 months until she can no longer hide him. That's in verse 3. And so she creates a little basket-like thing that will float, and she puts him in the tall reeds of a riverbank. What part of the river did she put him in? Not like actually the physical name of the part, but who goes there frequently?
Pharaoh's daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter. She goes to bathe in that area, and this time she's doing what she would typically do in verse 5, and she finds this baby in the reeds. And she looks at him, opens this basket, and sees him crying, And it's almost like an instant connection. You know, you see this poor little baby who's been left behind, and it says that she felt compassion for him, and she wanted to take the boy as her own. And since the boy was still young enough to be nursed, and obviously she didn't just give birth, so she can't nurse him right away, the maidens asked if they wanted to find a Hebrew woman who would nurse him. Why did they say a Hebrew woman? Because he looked like a Hebrew. So they go and find it, and this is one of those providential parts of the story where it's just so amazing to me. Who do they find to be the one to nurse Moses? His own mom. And so it all works out. I mean, just too perfectly to be accidental in verse 8. And the child in verse 10 grows until it no longer needs to be nursed. So the mother got to spend some valuable time with her child. And then Pharaoh's daughter took him as her own and named him Moses, which, by the way, Moses is an Egyptian name, and it means to be drawn out because she drew him out of the water. That's what the text will tell us. But it is also very fitting because God is going to use Moses to draw the people out of Egypt. And so, even in the very beginning, we're already kind of getting the idea of who this is going to be. So, then in verses 11 through 15, Moses grows older, verse 11. And he has clearly become a very intelligent man. He's been growing in the nation of Egypt. He's been treated as an Egyptian, but he knew that he wasn't an Egyptian, right? Yeah, because he says he went out and he looked at the suffering of his own people. And when he saw an Egyptian beating one of his brethren, as he would say, what does he do? Yeah, he kills him. Now, we don't know how Moses knew who he was, but he did. And maybe the family of Pharaoh told him all the time, but we're going to see later that when he's in Midian, they think he's an Egyptian because of how he looks now, similar to what happened with Joseph, who lived in that culture for so long. But when he kills this Egyptian, he thinks he's gotten away with it, right? Because he goes home and he comes out the next day. But before we go into that, I just want to say that we don't really know if he meant to kill the Egyptian. We know that he saw someone beating someone and he went to stop it. And it doesn't seem like there was malice. It could have been one of those things where just the heat of the moment you accidentally kill someone, or maybe he did intend to kill him. The thing is, as much as that's debated, we don't know. What we do know is that there was a dead Egyptian, and after he kills this Egyptian in verse 12, he looks around, he's like making sure nobody saw him, and then he hides him in the sand. And so, remember how the Egyptians felt about the Hebrews? Right. In Genesis chapter 43 and verse 32, we're told that Joseph had to sit at a separate table from his brethren because it was seen as an abomination even to sit at the same table to eat with the Hebrews. And so imagine a Hebrew kills an Egyptian. Well, it doesn't matter the Hebrew standing in the kingdom of Egypt. That is despicable in their eyes. And that's what's just happened. And so verse 13, he comes back a little bit later, and what does he see? Yeah, two of his own brethren, the Hebrews or the Israelites, were fighting. And he tries to calm them down, but what do they say?
Who are you to judge us?
Yeah. Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? Can you imagine the panic in that moment? Just for a second, have you ever done something that you thought nobody else knew about, and then it was brought up to you later? How shocking is that in that moment? You're like, you saw that? No, you heard about it from someone else, meaning that lots of people know that I did that? But this time, it's about Moses murdering an Egyptian. So you can imagine that he is completely in panic, and we know that he is because he runs away immediately. But it's for good reason because in verse 15, Pharaoh is going to kill him for this. And so he leaves from Egypt and he takes this journey all the way over to Midian. which would be close to about 140 miles from where he was to there. So it's a long journey. He really wants to make sure that he is getting out of Egypt. But now we're put in the situation, verses 16 through 25, where he's in Midian. And while he's in Midian, when he arrives there immediately anyway, he finds some women who were trying to feed their or to water their flocks. But then some men come and try to push the women away to water their own flocks. But Moses comes in, defends the women, and then helps them water their flocks. And this is the section where they go over to their father and say, an Egyptian has saved us, because they thought he was Egyptian. I mean, he was that engrossed in it anyways. But while he's in Midian, he marries a woman named Zipporah, and he has one of his sons named Gershom. And during his time over there, the Pharaoh and all the people who sought his life died. That's what it says in verse 23. And while he was there, and while the people of Israel were over in Egypt being greatly oppressed, they started crying out to God. And the section is very important because it says God hears them, and he remembers and is going to act on his covenant with them. And we know that he's going to be doing that very soon. And so that brings us into chapter 3. Are there any questions on chapter 2? Okay. We're going to need to go through chapter 3 a little bit quicker. But Moses has been a shepherd in Midian for 40 years. How do we know that? Does the text tell us in Genesis 2 and 3 that he was there for 40 years? No, it doesn't. We would only know that through the New Testament, where we are given some recollections in Acts chapter 7, 29 through 30, when talking about Moses being in Midian, where he had two sons, and when 40 years had passed, that's when we come to the section that we're at now. And so one day, Moses is leading his flock, and remember, he's over here in the northern Midian. He's leading his flocks over in the wilderness of Sinai, around right here, if we're going to believe the average belief that that's where it is. And this is the also known as the wilderness of Horeb. Horeb and Sinai are the same place, just different names to different nations. Just like there are still different names for different nations all around the world today. Like India is not actually India. I can't remember what they call it, but it's something completely different. Same situation here. Horeb is Sinai. Moses is out there, and suddenly he sees an amazing sight in verse 2. What is it? Yeah. Interestingly, a bush that is on fire but not burning up. This was the only picture I could find that really illustrated that well. All the greenery that is still there while it's set ablaze. I mean, it was literally like the fire was just resting on it. And so he turns aside, and God calls to him from inside the bush, and he says, Moses, Moses. And what does Moses say? Here I am. And God tells him, don't come any closer. Take off your sandals. Why? You're on holy ground. Ground that's supposed to be made special for the Lord. And then God tells Moses that he is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And when this happens, Moses hides his face because he is too ashamed even to look towards this bush where God is. And he's too afraid. And then God says that he has seen the misery of his people in Egypt, and he has heard their cry because of their taskmasters, and he knows their sorrows. And he's come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them into this great land that we've been talking about in verse 8. So in chapter 1, we saw God clearly established the first promise of making them into a great nation. And by this point, they have 603,550 men of war, because that is going to be the number that Moses brings out of Egypt. And so he tells Moses that he's going to send him over to Pharaoh to bring the Israelites out. But Moses, it's almost immediately objects to what God says. And he says, who am I? What am I that you should send me out of all the children of Israel to bring them out of Egypt? This is in verse 11. But God doesn't argue with Moses' feelings of inadequacy, which is very interesting. Instead, all he does is answer, I will certainly be with you. And that's an important point that we'll talk about a little bit more later. Moses says, I'm inadequate. God doesn't say you're wrong. But what God says instead is, you have me, so it doesn't matter. I am with you. And so, as proof, God gives a sign, and that the sign will be after the people are brought out of Egypt, that he specifically, Moses, will serve God on that mountain, which, according to the text, is Hebron. And what is going to happen at Mount Hebron, also known as Mount Sinai? Yeah. There's going to be major things that happen. The law, the priests, the tabernacle, and who is the one that God is directly using to deliver those things? Moses. And so, telling him here that he's going to return to this mountain and he's going to be serving him. That's in verse 12. And so then we get into verses 13 through 22, and Moses asks what he should do if the people want to know who sent him. What's your name? Verse 13. And God replies, I am who I am. You can imagine, what? I am? And then he tells Moses to say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you, verse 14. And specifically to identify him as Yahweh, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, verse 15. And your Bibles, most likely, unless you have the LSB, will say the Lord in all caps. And as we've said before, when that happens in your translations, that's Yahweh every time in the Hebrew. The Lord, all caps, is Yahweh. And then God gives Moses the full plan, which is he's going to go to Egypt, gather the elders, tell them what God has said and what he's going to do to bring them out of Egypt into the promised land. And he tells Moses to reassure him that the elders are going to listen, and they're going to have to go together to ask Pharaoh to let the people go to a 3-day journey in the wilderness to sacrifice. Now, that's interesting because it's not that he starts out with, let my people go, but let us make this journey to sacrifice. And originally, this would mean that they'd go this journey into the wilderness, they'd sacrifice, and they'd come back to Egypt. But God warns that Pharaoh is not going to listen to this request. And so he's going to have to stretch out his hand to strike Egypt with many wonders. And specifically, God is going to show us later that each one of these wonders is supposed to fight against one of the Egyptian gods to show God's powers more. And eventually, the Egyptians will have to let them go. But interestingly, he ends by saying they will basically plunder the Egyptians on the way out. And so there's a lot that's going to have to happen to get us there, but there's a lot God's going to do before that happens. And just a brief point to end off chapter 3, God says here, when he's talking to Moses, when he asks you what your name is, he says, I am, as a clear indicator that all of the Hebrews would know which God they're talking about, the God, Yahweh. Now that's very important because who in the New Testament says, I am? Jesus. And it's a reference all the way back to here. And so we can see Jesus working in Exodus. I am. And then also Yahweh God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Very important that we remember that when we read that about Jesus in the New Testament. But anyways, are there any questions or thoughts on chapter 3? Okay. Now chapter 4. In chapter 4, the first 9 verses, Moses continues to reject what God is saying to him. And so he's still standing at this burning bush, but it's just like he's not convinced after God tells him all of these things. And so he tells the Lord in verse 1, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you. But again, for the second time, instead of getting frustrated with Moses, God responds with an illustration of power. And he gives Moses 3 signs that will show that he is from God. What's the first sign? Hmm?
The staff.
Yeah, the staff will.
The serpent.
Yeah, he throws the staff on the ground and it turns into a serpent. And I like that when it happens, Moses is shocked and he jumps back, and God has to tell him, go pick it up by the what? The tail. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever messed with snakes, but I've caught a great many snakes on the farm growing up. And if you ever touched it by the tail, you know what's going to happen?
It's gonna go back.
Yeah, you're going to get bitten. And so God tells Moses to catch it by the tail, and he's probably looking at him like, okay. But he picks it up, and what happens? Yeah, straight back into a rod, doesn't hurt him at all. And God says, you're going to show it to them. You're going to do the same thing. What's the next sign?
He got leprosy when he was, and his leprosy.
Yeah, exactly. He puts a perfectly healthy hand into his robe, and he pulls it out, and it describes it as being white with leprosy, which I was going to put a picture up here to show you, but it was a little too gross. What it is when you're white with leprosy is how leprosy starts. Your skin starts to boil up and peel off as white, and you can't really move it. It's really gross. So you can imagine you pull out and you put in a normal hand, you pull out this disgusting, probably painful hand, and then God says, put it back, and it comes back to normal. He says, do that, and show them all again. And then there was one more sign that God says, or if the people still refuse to believe, and what was it? It'll end up being the first plague. Yeah, water in the blood. You just take a little bit of the water out of the Nile, throw it onto the ground, and it will become blood. And these 3 signs were given so that they would believe that the Yahweh that Moses is claiming really sent him. So then Moses objects again. And he says one more time, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." And the Lord becomes very angry with Moses this time. And who did you read already?
What?
Read chapter 4 and verse 11, please.
So the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth, or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say.
Now, keep this in mind. God is frustrated with Moses at this point, according to the text, and yet he still shows mercy in his response by not doing anything to Moses. And so he says, I made your mouth. I make all the mouths. I can make people see, I can make them deaf. I can do it all. And you're going to tell me you can't speak with what I gave you? But anyways, he then tells him out of mercy that he will send Aaron, Moses' brother, to be his spokesman. And Moses is going to tell Aaron the words that come directly from God. And even verse 16, God says, you're going to be like God to Aaron, because God does this to Moses, and Moses is going to do this for Aaron. And Aaron's going to speak those words. So when it says you're going to be like God to Aaron, you're literally going to be giving him the exact words from God, and Aaron is going to speak. He's basically telling him, you've got no excuse. You're going to do this. But if Moses did not do it, God would have chosen somebody else. But then he also tells Moses, as Moses finally relents, to grab his staff because he's going to need it to perform the signs in verse 17. And so Moses goes back to his father-in-law Jethro and asks permission to return to Egypt. And now they have 2 sons because Zipporah and their 2 sons head back. But we come to an interesting section where on the journey to Egypt, he comes and confronts Moses with a warning. What's the warning? It's about when he confronts Pharaoh. He's not going to listen. His heart is going to be hardened. But God is telling him ahead of time, again, this is going to be hard. And so God again says he's going to stretch out his hand and strike Egypt with all of these wonders. And only after he has done that will Pharaoh finally release Egypt. And so the final section, verses 24 through 31, we come to Moses and his family traveling, but something shocking happens while they're lodging at a place along the way. What does it say in verse 24 that the Lord was about to do?
Said he sought to kill him.
He's going to kill Moses. Now you're reading chapter 4 and you're like, where did this come from? But we have to finish reading the chapter and we see that his son were not yet circumcised. Now, think about this for a minute. You remember what happened right after the new law was, I mean, not the new law, but the Levitical law was given. God just finished specifying exactly how you were to worship him. And then two of Aaron's sons offered the incorrect fire. What happened?
When they killed him.
Immediately killed. Why? Well, God had just finished telling them exactly what they had to do. This was going to be the most important, the first session of worship after these new things have been entered, and they disrespected him by not doing it the way he told them to. Well, we come to a similar situation here, and Zipporah points that out to us. God had just finished talking to Moses about he was going to be the chosen one to lead the people out of Egypt. God wanted him to do all of this, and yet Moses had not been following the law that God had already given. What was the covenant that was already supposed to be a part of their life?
Circumcision.
Circumcision. He gave that all the way back into Abraham. And so immediately after God gives all of this responsibility to Moses, Moses isn't fulfilling what has already been given as a requirement to serve God. And so God, already frustrated with Moses for being so reluctant, is saying, all right, you're not going to do what I say. It's time to end it. So he comes over, but who saves the day in this situation?
Aaron.
Zipporah, because she circumcises the son, and it's really a gross picture, but she comes and she throws the flesh that was taken on the feet of Moses. And she's like, you are a husband of blood. You would have us all die. And we don't know if Zipporah knew about the covenant and realized this is why it would happen. We don't know how Zipporah knew that they were about to die, but we're thankful she did know because she put them back in a right relationship with God. And it might seem like this is a little bit cruel because God is just coming and he's going to end it. But Moses knew what to do. He's known for a long time, and he just spent all this time directly talking to God, and he still had neglected to do it. And we know he has specifically neglected to do it because God would have given him another warning if it was unintentional. God wouldn't have just gone to this method. He always gives some sort of warning. So Moses had everything he needed, and yet he didn't do it, even after directly communicating with God. Does that make sense? And so it was almost Moses' time to go, but thankfully Zipporah stopped it. Are there any questions or thoughts on that section? I know that Kathy wanted to talk about it. Was that helpful? Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, we'll finish the chapter. Because Moses and Aaron meet at the mountain of God, which is what mountain? Sinai, or Horeb as it's called here, but we know it's going to be called Sinai later. And they embrace, and Moses tells Aaron everything the Lord has shown to him, and together they go back into Egypt. So they meet. Moses goes from here back to here after he grabs his family. He meets Aaron here, and now they're going all the way back to Goshen, which is where the people are, and they gather the elders together. They tell them what the Lord has shown to them, and it ends the chapter with the Israelites believing, but not only believing, they bow their heads and worship the Lord. And so these 4 chapters were very important in establishing everyone is now on the same page under one leader as a great nation, the leader that God has brought up for himself. This first promise is fulfilled, and now they're setting everything up to fulfill the second promise. And that promise will be fulfilled in the book of Joshua, but there's a lot that happens before that. So are there any thoughts or questions on the 4 chapters we looked at today?
Well, Moses, I think it's just an application today for me that Moses doubted God. It's okay for us to question and doubt God. We sometimes hesitate in our prayers. When our prayers aren't answered, it's okay for us to ask again and again, and ought to be careful. But there's a line where Moses crosses into disobedience, and that's when God gets angry. So
Yeah.
it's important for us to know that God, He didn't pick somebody perfect or 100% qualified on purpose, and just this man to fulfill His plan.
Yeah.
He had the same for us, and sometimes we will doubt our abilities or our faithfulness, and it's okay as long as we don't disobey.
Yeah. And that is important. God never condemns doubt when it's something we're working out. Right? He wants us, he's not fearful of our questions. He wants us to answer those questions of doubt, not just let them ruminate. But the reason he got mad at Moses was because he had doubts, but God himself is talking to Moses and he's like, I'm going to do this for you. I'm reassuring you this is going to happen. And Moses doubts again and again. But and that it would be the same for us if like we were doubting and we've been given evidence after evidence after evidence, but we were still thinking, no, I'm going to think my way. It comes to that point where there's a line that's going to be drawn. So that's a good point. And I think if there's nothing else, I don't remember if I had any more slides. Nope. All right. So thank you for your attention. We're going to go at a different pace after we get through the plagues because a lot more chapters go together, but I'll send out in the email. But for next week, just again, the next 4 chapters. Good morning again to everyone. I'm very thankful to be here. It is such a privilege to be back. I'm thankful for the visitors we have this morning, and I'm thankful for all of you for coming together to worship. Kirk asked me yesterday what the theme was so that he could pick songs for the lesson this morning, and I gave him something easy. I said, you can pick from the entire Bible. Because this morning, that's what we are going to be looking at, is the entire Bible. The word Bible comes from the Greek word biblios, which means the books. And it was named that because it's not one big book, but it's a collection of 66 individual books written by around 40 authors over a period of 1,500 years. And the authors consist from shepherds all the way up into kings and all the jobs in between. And yet, what is so amazing about the Bible is despite all that time that passed and the differences between all the authors, it is one concise, perfect story about how God brought man back into his presence. And it begins all the way in Genesis chapter 1. We're not going to do a PowerPoint this morning because I think it's more effective if we turn together in the scriptures. So if you would open in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then verse 2 tells us how the earth was without form and it was just a great big void. And so, in day 1 of creation, God creates light to bring sight to what this is. And then on day 2, he starts to give form to this formless void, and he creates the skies and the seas and separates them from one another. And then on the 3rd day, he creates the land and puts the plants that go on the land. On day 4, he gives the earth a system of time by creating the sun, moon, and stars so that we could have day and night and a way to tell the seasons and the years. And then on day 5, God fills the skies that he created with birds and the seas that he created with fish. And finally, we come to day 6, where it says specifically in the text that God starts with the smallest creeping things and creates everything up to the largest mammals. And then finally, on day 6, very distinctly from everything else God created, he made man. But why was man distinct? What made us different? Well, let's look at Genesis 1, verse 26. Verse 26 says, Then God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish, the birds, the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created him. And so the way that we were distinct from the animals is that mankind was made in the image of God. And we, of course, don't know if that means our physical bodies look like God. No man has ever seen God in his full glory. But what it means when we're made in his image is that we were made with a piece of him. We were given a soul that was breathed into us by the very breath of God. In the same way that when a mother and father has a child, that child has parts of the creators of him, so do we have a part of God who created us. And so in Genesis 1 and verse 31, God looks at everything that he created and he said, It was very good. And that completes day 6. And so in Genesis 2 and verse 2, we get to day 7 where it says that God rested from all the work which he has done. And it's not that God took a break from working on day 7. He still had a full-time job of holding the world together. Colossians chapter 1 verses 16 and 17 says that all things consist through him and he holds all things together. But what it means when he took a break or rested is that he got to complete his work of creation and enjoy the beauty of what he had made. And so the 7 days of creation were completed. And we enter into a period where mankind, both Adam and Eve, get to walk in a perfect relationship with God. We're given images in chapter 3 of God literally walking in the garden amongst them. But unfortunately, while they were in the Garden of Eden, which God had created for them, this perfect place with that perfect relationship, Satan enters into the garden and he tempts Eve to do the one thing that God told them not to do, to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And so then she gets her husband Adam to eat of that same fruit, and sin enters into the world. And the thing is, to understand everything else from this point onward, we have to understand what sin is. And Isaiah 59 and verse 2 tells us very clearly, sin separates you from God. Sin is an action of anything that goes against God's perfect creation or his perfect nature. And when we commit a sin, do something that he could not do as a perfect God, we create a barrier between us and him that is impassable. And that is what Adam and Eve did in the garden. But what is so amazing about this story in Genesis chapter 3 is that immediately after sin enters into the world, God is already revealing that he has a plan to bring mankind back to himself. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, God is speaking to the Satan about what he has done. And he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. When it talks about between you and the woman, your seed and her seed, there's going to be from this point on a constant battle between the ones who will follow God, the children of God, and the ones who will follow the world, the children or the seed of Satan. But God says there will be a day where you think you've won. I'll send someone and you'll bruise him on the heel. But in reality, he will crush your head, winning the battle. And this is known as the first promise of the Christ, who will come of the seed of woman, Jesus born of Mary. And so from Genesis 3:15 through the rest of the scripture, God is working to make this promise happen, to bring mankind back into that relationship that they separated themselves from in Genesis chapter 3. And so in Genesis chapter 5, we begin following the lineage of Seth, Adam's son. And it takes us all the way down to a man named Noah. And by the time of Noah, in Genesis chapter 6, if you're there with me, we see that a long time has passed from the days in the garden. And now God comes down and looks at what is happening on the earth. And Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5 says, Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thought of man's heart was only evil continually. We enter into a period of time where everything that anyone thought about was wicked. There was no good except what we see in verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Everyone around them, everyone else in the world was focused on evil, but God found one family, Noah, his 3 sons, and all of their wives, who still faithfully served him. And so God sends a flood to wipe out all the evil, but in his grace and mercy, he reserves Noah and his family through the ark. And so after the flood, after Noah, Shem is chosen to be the next in line of the Messiah. And just 100 years after the flood, we get to Genesis chapter 11. And in Genesis chapter 11, the people are again choosing to directly disobey God. After the flood, God said, "Spread throughout the earth and fill it." But in Genesis 11, all the people say, "Let's stay together so that we don't get spread throughout the earth." And so God takes things into his own hands and he divides up their languages and spreads them out in Genesis 11 and verse 9. And so at the end of Genesis 11, we get more of this lineage. Well, I guess not. Yeah, the end of Genesis 11. And we go all the way down from Shem, Noah's son, to Terah, the father of Abraham. And in Genesis chapter 12, God chooses Abraham to be the one through whom he's going to work the promise to bring the Christ. He gives Abraham, known as Abram in chapter 12, 3 promises that we've talked about so much over the last few months. The promise that they will become a great nation, as many people as the dust of the earth. They will inherit a beautiful land flowing with milk and honey, the land of Canaan. And ultimately, the most important of these promises, that the whole world will be blessed through their descendants or through their seeds. And so God works with Abraham to make sure that this is established. And then these promises are given to his son Isaac in Genesis chapter 26. And then in Genesis chapter 28 to Isaac's son Jacob. And finally, to conclude the book of Genesis, these promises are given to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. The whole book of Genesis, as we've seen over the last few months, is entirely about God providing a way and the foundation for his son, the Christ, to come. But that brings us into the book of Exodus, which is where we are now in our class. And the people have become a very large nation in Israel, as we saw in Exodus chapter 1 this morning. And we're told that this is the fulfillment of that nation promise. But there's a problem. Although they've become big, they've also become enslaved, and harshly enslaved, to the point where they are crying out to God to bring them out of the land of Egypt. And so God raises up a leader named Moses, whom we talked about this morning, and he sends Moses into Egypt to bring the people out. And in order to do so, God sends 10 plagues on the land of Egypt, until finally, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh agrees to let the people go out of Egypt. So God has raised up this first promise of a great nation, and he brings them out into the wilderness. You may remember that map from this morning. And they go to the place called Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb. Both are the same place. And 3 major things happen here. While they're there, they spend 1 year at the bottom of this mountain. And God first brings out the priesthood, which he chooses the Levites, Aaron being the first high priest. Then he gives them the law, the book of Leviticus, and for them to follow closely through the hand of Moses. And also they build the tabernacle, which is a place where the people can come together and worship the one true God. And all of this happens in Exodus chapter 19 all the way through Numbers chapter 10. All of that is entirely at Mount Sinai. And so we come to Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14. The people are ready, finally. They have the law, they have the priesthood, they have a place to worship God, and they are ready to enter into that promised land. And so they collect 12 spies from the different tribes, and they send them into the land to scout it out, to see whether or not it was a good time to take it. Well, the 12 come back, and unfortunately, 10 out of the 12 spies, everyone except for Joshua and Caleb, said that they could not take the land because there were giants in the land. They were too strong, men of war from their birth, and Israel just wasn't ready. It was too hard. And so Numbers 14, beginning in verse 3 says, Numbers 14, beginning in verse 3, why has the Lord brought us to this land, to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return back to Egypt? Verse 4, so they said to one another, let's elect a leader to return us to Egypt. This is truly a tragedy because the people had 603,550 men of war, which is a large army by any standard, even today. But most importantly, they had God on their side. And yet they let the word of 10 men get them so scared that they thought it would be better to go back to the land of Egypt. And all fell for that except for Joshua, Caleb, and of course Moses. And so we enter into the period known as the wilderness wanderings, which is from Numbers chapter 10 all the way to Deuteronomy chapter 34. Because of the people's fears, God says that everyone over the age of 20, except for Joshua and Caleb, will die in the wilderness before they take the land. Numbers chapter 14, 32 and 34. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and bear the brunt of your infidelity until your carcasses are consumed in the wilderness, according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. Why were the people sent out into the land to wander when they failed? Well, first we've got to think about this whole time on the way to Canaan, they've been complaining, rejecting God, and yet he continues to push through, to redeem them, to bring them to the very land which he promised. And then at the end of it all, they reject him again and say, let's go back to Egypt. God could no longer use this people. And so they all were better off dying in the wilderness than wasting any more of God's time. So it's very sad, but they wander for 40 years. And in Deuteronomy chapter 34, Moses, the one who has led them this whole time, finally looks into the land from a tall mountain and dies. Deuteronomy 34. But then we enter into a new time where Joshua, one of the spies who followed the Lord throughout all of this turmoil, he was elected as leader. Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9 tells us that. And the book of Joshua is divided into two halves. The first 12 chapters are all about the people conquering the land of Canaan. And so they go through it, they take everything that God gave to them. And then the second 12 chapters, chapter 12 through 24, is all about dividing it amongst the tribes. But I'd like to look at one verse in particular, Joshua 21, verse 43, that really nails this point in the head. Joshua 21, verse 43. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. Verse 45, not a single word failed of any good thing the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All of it came to pass. And so in Egypt, God fulfilled the promise of making them a great nation. And now, Joshua 21, verse 30, 43, and 45, he fulfills the land promise. And so from Joshua all the way to the end of the Old Testament is now about fulfilling that final promise, the promise of bringing Jesus to save the world. And so we enter into another period known as the Judges, and this is the book of Judges, and it goes all the way through 1 Samuel chapter 7. What happens is in Judges, a generation came who did not know God. Judges chapter 2, look at verse 10. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baals. So, whether this is the fault of the fathers or the grandfathers, whatever the case is, the next generation was not taught of the great deeds that God had done in the conquering of the land. And so this next generation did not know God, and they served Baal and did evil. And so what happens in the book of Judges is God sends an outside nation to oppress them, to show them what happens when they don't have the power of God. And so then the people are like, we don't want this. Please, God, save us. And so God sends a judge. The judge saves the people through the power of God. The judge dies, and the people did the same thing again, entering right back into sin because they did not teach their future generations. But even during this terrible time, where it really, as you read through the book, it just looks like it is going downhill continuously, God is still working to preserve those promises. And during the same time period, we have the book of Ruth. It's happening during the Judges. And Ruth is a lady from an outside nation who had more fear of God than the people who were God's people at the time. And because of her and what all she does in her story, she ends up marrying a man named Boaz, and that puts her in the direct lineage of the chosen Messiah. And so, even during this terrible time, God is working. And we see in Ruth chapter 4 and verse 22 that from Ruth and Boaz, a very important man, is born named David. So we finish this by going to 1 Samuel chapter 8. After 300 years of the judges continually having to come and save the people, we come to Samuel, who is the last judge. And the people go up to him and they say, "You're old. Your kids, they're no good. We want a king." And what is so telling about this request is they specifically say, "So that we can be like the nations around us." The whole point of God doing all of this so far was to make them a distinct people, a holy people. But they threw that all away. But God makes sure that we know that, but also he makes sure Samuel knows that. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." So again, the people reject God. So we enter into the United Kingdom of Israel. And there are three kings who rule in the United Kingdom. The first king that God anoints is Saul, who starts out as a very humble man, but ends up rejecting God over and over again to the point where God says, "You're cut off. I'm choosing a man who will act like me, a man after my own heart." And we're brought back to the end of Ruth chapter 4 and verse 22 because the next man that God chooses to rule is David, the son of Jesse, Ruth's relative. So David rules for 40 years, and he is a good king. Although we know he had faults, he followed the Lord. And every other good king that ever comes is compared to David in his righteousness. But then God gives to David those promises that we've been following. He says that you will have a ruler in Judah forever. And of course, that goes all the way down to Jesus. So after David dies, his son Solomon becomes king. Solomon, the wisest man in all the earth, again rules 40 years. And he starts out great. He's doing a lot of good, builds the temple of the Lord, and brings Israel into a place of great prosperity. So great that they say silver was like stones. Nobody cared. They were so rich. But unfortunately, we come to 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11, we'll read verse 7. 1 Kings 11:7. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all of his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. He loved the women of the world more than he loved God, at least at this point. And because of this blunder, although we know Solomon did good and was considered a good king, he introduced again idolatry into the nation of Israel, which is now going to be a thorn in their side for the rest of their existence on the earth. But then Solomon dies in 931 BC, and he has two sons, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, who divide the kingdom amongst themselves. Rehoboam to the south in the kingdom of now Judah, and Jeroboam to the north in the kingdom that keeps the name Israel. And to the south is the kingdom Judah that will keep the lineage of the Christ. And every king from Rehoboam all the way down to their last king Zedekiah will be of that lineage until they're cut off and put on pause until they come back later. And they have a total of 19 kings, but only 5 of those kings worship the Lord and are considered good. Many prophets were during this time that fill the rest of these scriptures, like Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah. They all worked during the time of Israel and Judah, and they were trying to keep the word of the Lord alive. Israel, the kingdom to the north, also had 19 kings, but can you guess how many of those were good? 0. And so they were wiped out by the Assyrians in 720 BC because of their constant evil. So now we enter into the time of Judah alone, and this begins in 2 Kings chapter 18. And there are 8 kings left in Judah after the rule of Israel. And Isaiah is continuing to work in this time alongside Jeremiah, and they last a little over 100 years longer than Israel did. But Judah also did evil, so much evil that if you turn to 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 16, God says there's nothing left he can use them for. Verse 16 of 2 Chronicles 36. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of God arose against his people. The last line, until there was no remedy. What was so much worse about Judah is that Jeremiah tells us they saw that Israel fail because of their sin, and yet they kept on sinning. And so he says, Judah, you're worse than Israel. And there was no way any longer. God had given them chance after chance and prophet after prophet, yet they would not turn back. And so God sends Babylon to capture Judah in 3 waves. The first is in 605, and that's where we get the prophet Daniel. He is taken into captivity into Babylon. And then in 586, Ezekiel is captured, and they destroy many of the fortressed cities of Judah. And then finally, in 586 BC, Jeremiah remains in Judah to see the destruction of Jerusalem, to see the destruction of the temple, and that's where we get the book of Lamentations, where he writes about the terrible things that happened from there. And then they are turn to Jeremiah chapter 25. In Jeremiah, he also tells us very specifically how long the people are going to be in this captivity. And he says that it's going to be for 70 years. Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 11. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. And so again, we come to a point where all hope for God's promises seem lost. But he reserved a remnant. Jeremiah repeats that there are still a remnant. And he repeats that the line of the Messiah will be reserved even amongst all of this. And so if you turn back right after 2 Chronicles, we come to the book of Ezra. And Ezra, after 70 years of captivity, the Babylonians were taken over by the Persians, and Ezra comes and brings a small remnant back to the land of Israel. And this event is supposed to be so great and so memorable that Jeremiah 16 says, no longer will you call me the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, but you'll call me the God who brought you from the entire world, from all the nations. And he completes this promise. And so Ezra 1 through 6 is all about that first return. And then there's a break from Ezra 6, and we go to the book of Esther. And during this timeline, Esther saves all of the people of Judah from extinction through the things that she did there. Then we're brought back to Ezra in chapter 7 through chapter 10, and a second return comes, more people to rebuild the place of Jerusalem. And finally, in 444 BC, the third group returns with a man named Nehemiah, and they rebuild the temple. Does anyone remember how long? Well, now that I said, does anyone remember? Gone. I believe it was 2 years. But they rebuilt the walls in 52 days. And then as well, Haggai and Zechariah are here during this time to continue help the people encourage building. And so all is restored, including the worship, the Levitical priesthood, and the law, which was what Nehemiah so heavily emphasized getting back in order. So turn with me now to Malachi. As we finish the Old Testament, Malachi chapter 4. Malachi chapter 4, beginning in verse 5, he says, God says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to children, and the hearts of children to their father, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse." And so Malachi finishes off the Old Testament with writing that one day God is going to send someone, who he calls Elijah in this case, who is going to prepare the way for the Messiah, verse 4. And we know that that man is going to be John the Baptist. But after Malachi puts his pen down in chapter 4, there's a great famine, a famine that was prophesied about in Amos chapter 8 and verse 11, where it says, "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread or of thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord." And so when Malachi finished writing, there's a period of 400 years where this famine of not hearing from the Lord is happening. As prophesied in Amos 8 and verse 11. And so after Malachi puts it down, there's silence from God from 434 BC until we pick up in Luke. And for those 400 years, the people in the land were waiting for what Galatians 4 and verse 4 calls the fullness of the times. Now, what is the fullness of the times? During this silent years, God just wasn't not working at all. He just wasn't sending prophets. But what he was doing was working behind the scenes to make things ready for Jesus to come. When the people were taken into captivity and the Persians took over, did they have anywhere to worship? Did they have a temple? No. And so when the Babylonians took them over, they spread them throughout the world. And the Jews still wanted some way to keep their identity, to worship God. And so they invented something called the synagogue. And this is very important because where does Paul go first? Wherever there is a synagogue. The synagogue. And from the synagogue, many of the New Testament churches were established. Why? Because there was a place in almost every city where there were people who knew Yahweh. And from there, he could look at the scriptures with people who believed in the scriptures and build that Jesus was the Christ from there. And that started happening even in the captivity, seeing God's providence as early as then. But later on, the Persians take over the Babylonians. The Persians are defeated by the Greeks, and this is around the 300s BC. The Greeks spread a language across the entire earth that has not been seen before. A language that, by the way, is very specific. A language that you can know what they meant when you read what they're saying. And it was a lot like English, where if you didn't know Greek yourself, you at least knew somebody who knew some Greek, because it was such a common language. And this is going to be so important because in the New Testament, everybody can know Greek. And when you have a common language, it makes it just that much easier to spread the word. And there had not been a common language like this since the days of Genesis chapter 11, when they were all spread apart. So God is doing this behind the scenes. But also during this time of the Greeks, there's something known as the Septuagint, which is where the Hebrew scriptures was translated into the Greek language, which meant anybody who wanted to could look and examine the scriptures to see if what the apostles later said was true. It was accessible. Then after the Greeks, the Romans took over. And the Romans built a system of roads that had literally never been seen before, where you could get from one end of the Roman world to the other end safely and quickly. And it was on those roads that the Romans prepared that the apostles spread the message throughout the whole world. And so there was no other time like the time when Jesus was born, because God had been working for centuries to make sure that everything was aligned so that his message could spread as fast as possible. And so we enter into the New Testament. And of course, the first book is Matthew, but actually Luke picks up exactly where Malachi leaves off. Malachi says at the end of his book that there will be someone to come like Elijah to prepare the way. And guess what Luke starts with? The birth of a man named John the Baptist, who's preparing the way for the Lord. And so, picking up exactly where it was left off, we see that is fulfilled. And then in Luke chapter 2, verses 4 through 7, the Christ, that promised seed, is finally born. Luke chapter 2, beginning in verse 4. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who is with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothing, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for him there. And we don't have time to look over it, but how many prophecies that one little paragraph fulfills? The Christ is finally brought into the world. And so after all of this that God has been working for over thousands of years, the Christ is brought into the world, and he lives and preaches on the earth. He lives for 33 years, but his ministry is only 3 years. And during that time, he is preaching that the kingdom of God has come, to repent, to be baptized into that kingdom. But unfortunately, as we know, he's killed for it. But thankfully, Luke 23, he is raised from the dead. And so after he is raised from the dead, proving what he said was true, proving that he is the one whom God has been working for in the whole Old Testament, he ends with what we know as the Great Commission. If you want to turn there, we'll just read the passages together. Matthew 28, verse 18. Many of us have this memorized. Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Once Jesus was raised, it says in verse 18, he came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me on heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Amen. Then in Luke 24, verse 47, he tells them to preach repentance to all the nations. And in Mark 16, verse 15 and 16, he says, go teach to all the world, and whoever is believed and is baptized shall be saved. And so we go to Acts chapter 1 now. Acts chapter 1. Acts is also written by Luke. And so we can literally go from Malachi to Luke to Acts for the exact consecutive events. And we go from Jesus telling them this to spending 40 days with them, chapter 1 and verse 3, to whom he also presented himself alive after suffering many infallible proofs, being seen by them 40 days, and speaking of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God. And so he finishes this last time period teaching them of what they have to do, how to teach others to come into the kingdom of God. And then Acts chapter 1 and verse 9, Jesus ascends back into heaven where he belongs. And then from this point on, we're all about the establishment of the church that Jesus came to bring. Jesus promised the Holy Spirit in this 40 days, and it happens in Acts chapter 2 when the apostles received that Holy Spirit. And from Acts chapter 2 to Acts chapter 28, the entire thing is about people entering into the kingdom and the church being firmly established. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch in Acts chapter 11. And so after Acts chapter 28, from Romans all the way to the book of Revelation, we have the apostles' writings on how to live as a part of that holy kingdom, which the entire scriptures has been working to bring. And so, I don't know how long we went, but we've just covered how this is all one story. And really, we've just scratched the surface, as you know. But you can see that This wouldn't happen naturally. When it comes to historical documents written by man, you can have two people 100 years apart who disagree on the same event. But here, we have thousands of years, tens of people, one story. And that story is how God worked to save each and every one of us through his son, Jesus Christ, and how Jesus brought the kingdom along with him. And so now, what the end of that story is about is Jesus inviting every one of us to be a part of that kingdom. And if we are already a part of that kingdom, inviting us to live like we're a part of that kingdom. And so if you're here this morning and you've seen the awesomeness of the story that God has given to all of us, the story that is a true account of history, he wants you to become a part of that story, a part of that kingdom. And we encourage you to join him now. But if you're already a part of that kingdom, I hope that this was encouraging and helpful to you to remember just what all God has done to get us here. And I hope that we can then use this to teach other people that same thing. And so let's continue to think on this as together we stand and sing.